Today, we are going to be reviewing the parts of the scientific method, which I know you've learned before in other classes, but it's always worth reviewing at the beginning of science classes just to make sure you didn't forget. A hypothesis is what you think the answer is. So in our last notes, I know it's been a little while, but I asked you the question, does running in the rain keep you drier than walking in the rain? That is a science question. A hypothesis is what do you think the answer to that question is? A hypothesis can't really be wrong as long as it makes sense. You need a reason for your hypothesis. So, for example, you could say, running in the rain will keep you drier because you're moving faster, so you'll get less wet. Your answer was running because reason. It is absolutely okay if you get to the end of your experiment and the hypothesis is wrong. That's the whole point of doing the experiment. I mean, if you already knew the answer, why are you experimenting on it? Seems kind of stupid. So, as long as your hypothesis makes sense and you can explain it, it's fine. Your hypothesis should have things that it can be tested in some way. There are lots of things you'd have to consider if you were actually going to send people out in the rain and make them run. You'd have to see how fast are they running or walking, where they are, what else is around them, how hard is it going to be raining, is there wind, what kind of clothes they have on. There's so many things you have to consider. We can make lists and lists and lists, but all of those things collectively are called variables. This is the longest one of the whole notes. So, a variable is anything that can affect an experiment. We can group them into 3 different kinds, depending on what the variable is for. So an independent variable, or sometimes called a manipulated variable, is what you are going to change. So in our experiment with rain, maybe we're going to change how fast the person's going. That would be our independent variable. The dependent or responding variable is the one that you're measuring. So in our case, it would be how wet they are, how dry they are. Control variables are everything else. In some places, you'll see independent and dependent. In some places, you'll see manipulated and responding. I learned independent and dependent. If either way, you're technically correct. They're just called slightly different things. We're going to write this out on the board in class, and I think that'll make a little bit more sense to you when you see them all written out. So if this is a little bit confusing, just hold on. After you do your experiment, you must present your results, which we actually did last week with graphs and tables. We already practiced that, so we're going to move on to the next part. I will show you the results in class. Mythbusters did this one, and we'll see how they did. So you did your experiment. You got all your numbers. You figure out what your results are. Now you need to figure out what your conclusion is. So what do your results mean? Are they different? How could I have done it better? What mistakes might I have made? Which happens. Mistakes happen. You just got to be honest about them. It's fine if your experiment ends up something you didn't want it to be at all. So, for example, a conclusion sentence might be, based on the data we found running in the rain results from wetter clothes because, explain yourself. In science, once you experiment on the same thing so much, you might be able to come up with laws or theories. The word law and theory, they mean something different in science than they mean everywhere else. If you try to Google these words, be very careful, because in science they do mean something very different. In science, a law is consistent over time. An example would be like Newton's laws, like every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction, something like that. A theory is a description. So cell theory is describing cells. Atomic theory is describing atoms. Both of these, you'll see it says it may change over time as new information is learned. Both a law and a theory are based on experiments. They have been tested. Both have data to support them. Both are truth. And both could be proven false if there's new data. So when you hear theory, it means something different in science. It is equally as true as a law. Just a law is kind of like math, whereas theory is more like a description, words. I think this is the end. Yep, last one. So you did all this experimentating. You have all your results and numbers and graphs and tables and all that fancy stuff. You need to write up a report. And most scientists in the real world, they will take their report and publish it into scientific journals so that other scientists can read it. So when you write up your lab report, it's basically step by step, here's what we did, here's why we did it, here's what we found. So that way, if somebody reads it, they can see what you got and how you got it. And maybe they could do it themselves. The end. So what should you know for sure from these notes? You should know a hypothesis, you should know the definition, and you should know that it needs a reason. You should know the difference between the three kinds of variables. We're going to practice pointing them out in different experiments. You should know what a conclusion is, but I think you do already. And you should be able to tell the difference between a theory and a law in science. Tell me what they are in science, not in everyday speak in science. The secret word for today will be theory. So on that very last question that pops up on Edpuzzle and asks you for the secret word, you know what it is now. Make sure your notes paper is all the way filled in and attached in your notebook, and I will see you next time.